Hello, and welcome to another edition of Ask the Professor, a feature in which we depend on you for the contributions that keep it in production and for the questions that we answer. We never seed our own. They all come from viewers, and they concern economics, they concern political philosophy, political culture, history, culture, architecture, please, more architecture. All those things that matter to us in our attempt to create a good life in our society.
All right, here's Isabel, and she says, since you frequently cite John Locke on what makes government legitimate, what books would you recommend on good government? Feel free to stop at 100.
That's going to be the hard part of stopping at 100. You know, there are so many books that it's a big challenge, but I will say yes, John Locke. His second treatise on civil government. You know, the first treatise is a refutation of the divine right of kings, and particularly the writings of Robert Filmer. As I say in one of our documentaries, if you want to see a man give a flying body slam to a disarticulated skeleton, go for it. But really nobody believes the divine right of kings anymore, so a demolition of it is of purely antiquarian interest. But the second treatise, even though he spells choose, C-H-U-S-E, if you get the right edition, starts from first principles, assuming that in a state of nature we have natural rights. We have the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to property. That is the right to the things we make with our time and the sweat of our brow. But it's hard to secure those rights. We enter into society and form governments to get those rights protected. And from that he analyzes what powers can government possibly have? Only those which we delegate to it. What rights or powers can we delegate to government? Only the ones we possess in a state of nature. And it's a wonderful demonstration. And I've challenged people in the documentaries, and I repeat the challenge. I defy modern people to take issue with Locke's premises. We're so caught up in self-ownership and self-actualization. But if you accept the premises, can you contest his logic? And if you can't, how do you deny his conclusions? So, Locke is essential. The prose is a bit dry and dusty, but the reasoning is so appealing. There's another book which I almost invariably recommend, Thomas Sowell's A Conflict of Visions. From somebody who'd been involved in various policy arguments and battles over many years, and then took a step back and asked why, on issues that seem unrelated to one another, from minimum wage to what was then a hot topic in foreign policy, aid to the Nicaraguan Contras to abortion, why do I find myself facing the same people in the debates, even though the issues seem unconnected? And so it's a very good meditation on the instinctive, really fundamental intellectual premises that people bring to issues that lead them to disagree. Even after Locke proves it, to my satisfaction, people still don't agree with it. So that's an important one for thinking about how to think about the problem. I would also say that you need to be familiar with the people whose views on government are appalling. You should read the Communist Manifesto, just for the same reason that doctors study diseases. It's been enormously influential.
The Little Red Book?
Probably the Little Red Book, although it's somewhat unreadable.
How about Mein Kampf?
I definitely Mein Kampf. I had my students read Mein Kampf, at least I assigned it. I thought it would make a good headline, right-wing professor assigns Hitler book. They didn't have much to say about it. I think they may not have read it because it was quite long. But it's important not only because you see that Hitler did warn people what he was doing, as the cliche has it, but also, counter to the cliche, in that book you find a very intelligent, very determined, and often witty man. People seem obliged to say if Hitler was evil, he must also have been stupid and ugly, and his mother dressed him funny. If Hitler had been stupid, we wouldn't know his name. He might have been just as evil, but he'd have stabbed a couple of people in the street and been hauled off to jail. It was the combination of evil and genius and ruthlessness that made him a genocidal warmonger instead of some shabby backroom brawler and, garden variety anti-Semite. I would also recommend Stalin's Foundations of Leninism, by the way, which is much shorter than Mein Kampf, much less witty, but again, a chillingly clear program. However, all of this gets us a bit away from good government. I like Edward Cook, but it's perhaps a little bit specialized. I do like Albert Van Dicey, The Law of the Constitution, explaining what goes on in the British parliamentary system. Again, maybe these are not the fundamental classics. There's a little pamphlet by Edward Corwin called The Higher Law Basis of American Constitutional Law that I also very much endorse. When I was starting to think systematically about constitutional law, I happened across this at a Liberty Fund catalog, and I read it, and it clarified for me this vital question. Given that, as a practical matter, we make law through a show of hands by the majority, but we know that law is not rendered legitimate just because of a majority vote. What is it we're trying to do when we debate and argue? If a majority vote legitimized law, then as soon as the law was passed, there'd be no further discussion. Well, it was a majority vote, it must be right. That's not our standard. That's our way of trying to settle disagreements about what the law should be. But that implies that there is something that the law should be. And if, for instance, a majority vote allows slavery, as it did in the United States prior to the Civil War, people can say, no, that man-made law is not proper law. We must have in our minds some conception of the so-called natural law, whether or not you think that law requires a lawgiver, whether it leads you to believe that there's a God or not. There is some sense we all have that murder would be wrong even if the statute book said it was right, in some cases or in all cases. And so we're trying to conform our law to ideal law. And it's interesting, the Romans are the first, another reason Rome is so vital to the story of Western civilization, to start realizing that the particular features of their own law, by contrast with other people's law, weren't what made their law better. That it was the things that all people thought, that theft is wrong, that murder is wrong, even if they disagreed about the definitions, that really mattered. Now, I could go on and on and on about this. In fact, I already have. I can see this from my interviewer here. But I have a list of the 100 books that everybody should read. It's not mostly about political philosophy. There is more to life than government. But I do think the first thing you should read is John Locke and say to yourself, are his premises right? Do we own ourselves? Does self-ownership give us the right to defend our physical safety against attack, to defend ourselves against enslavement, to defend ourselves against theft of things we have made without violating the rights of others? And do we form governments in order to protect those rights and give them only those powers we ourselves possess to exercise in defense of those rights? If that is true, does the modern state, even in a democracy like Canada, actually fulfill legitimate functions, or does much of what it does actually violate rights in the name of some greater good? If so, what are we to do about it practically? And how are we to convince people that although it is well-meaning endeavors that have led the state to be far too large and, in fact, to trample rights in the name of protecting them, how do we convince them that this is wrong and get them back to where they ought to be? Because it is so much that matters in life cannot be done by government, because government is force. And if government tries to do it, it ruins it. Because to say that something should be done by government is to say it should be done by force. And you can't relieve misery by force. You can't feed people by force. All of these things come out of John Locke. And it's good to look at Sowell to try to understand why people don't agree and have something resembling a productive discussion with them. Even if you can't get around the disagreement, you can at least not shout over it.
All right. Well, thanks for that, folks. If you would like to play along and ask your question, the URL on your screen will take you to a page where everything is explained. Thanks, and see you next time.